Welcome to the Zone. Today I have something different for you guys, the first part of a short story taking place in the Stalker universe. I've kind of tied it into the Shadow of Chernobyl story. If you guys can guess where you might have seen this character in the game, let me know in the comments below. Without further ado, let's get started. Mikhail scanned the surrounding area around the crash site as flames rose into a dark sky out of the remains of his unit's Mi-24 Hind. Littered around the crashed helicopter were mangled bodies intertwined with crash debris. Mikhail picked himself up out of the thick mud and attempted to stand to his feet. As he began to limp away from the wreck, he drew his AK-74U from his back and held it tightly in his hands. Every step he took away from the crashed vehicle shot white-hot pain up his leg. Being ejected from the Hind as it began to spin out of control was probably the only thing that saved his life. He scanned around the site, looking for any sign of life from the bodies of his unit laying around in the mud. Most were missing limbs or were ravaged beyond human recognition. He spotted an intact body about 20 meters away from his location, right next to the chopper. Mikhail limped towards the crash. "Fuck," he said aloud as he came upon the first body. Through his blurry vision, Mikhail could recognize that it was Peter, one of the other operators being transported to the center of the zone. His eyes were open, as if looking up at Mikhail, but the piece of shrapnel stuck in the belly's corpse revealed the cold truth of his friend's fate. As he began to pat down the body, taking any magazines or supplies that he could find, he felt the warm blood from Peter's abdomen soak his gloves. Popping and crackling came out of the smoldering wreckage, illuminating the contents of Mikhail's rucksack as he shifted it about, attempting to get a rough ammunition count. He did a rough count and believed that he had more than 1,000 rounds between the magazines he had looted and those he carried already. Mikhail wiped his forehead and looked down at his blood now covering his forearm and glove, mixing with the blood of his fallen comrade, still on his clothing. Mikhail struggled as he limped away further from the crash and slumped onto the ground, resting himself against a large tree and dropping the rucksack full of ammunition. He placed his hand on the gash oozing blood out of his forehead and reached for his IFAK, hoping to slow the bleeding. Most of the medical supplies and rations were in the chopper, he thought, and I'm pretty fucked up. Dazed, he patted around his chest pockets until he dug out a pack of cigarettes. Mikhail took one from the pack and lit it, staring at the burning chopper. Weeks of planning and training, months of reading and studying, and it all meant nothing, he thought. Every operation to date, going into this godforsaken hellhole, has been a disaster. Why would we be any different? What was Command thinking? What was the point? Thoughts raced through his mind. He scanned the area around the crash site, hoping to get his bearings. The chopper had crashed next to an old abandoned farm home, causing half the house to collapse as the Hind scraped across the roof. The clearing next to the house was once a field possibly containing animals, but was now abandoned. Behind him was a tree line that stretched along the western side of the farmhouse and curved up towards the north. If there were any streets or roads in the vicinity, he couldn't recognize any. Old farm equipment laid rusting off to the east of the farmhouse, long abandoned and forgotten by time. He rested his head back against the tree and looked up at the night sky, staring at the dark clouds churning overhead. He saw lightning and began to feel drops of rain hit off of his hood, and they began to cover his face. He didn't worry about the possible radiation. The hypothermia would probably get him quicker than any radiation sickness would. In a feeble attempt to follow standard operating procedures, he injected himself with anti-rad, rolling his eyes and letting out a brief sigh as he plunged the syringe into his hip. He removed it and let it roll out of his hand as his arm slumped down and hung off of his body. He didn't have the strength to move them, not even to take the burning cigarette out of his mouth as its heat began to slowly warm his nose. As Mikhail smoked what he thought would be one of his last few smokes of his life, he was startled to life and jarred from his daze by the sound of radio static. He swung his right arm up to his left shoulder. Clutching at the handheld radio attached to his chest rig, he held the button down for dear life and began to reach out to anyone in the area. "This is Sergeant Mikhail, 1st Company, 12th Army Aviation Brigade. We've crashed. The chopper just went dead." There are multiple KIA. Please respond. The lone soldier released the button and dropped his arms into his lap as he waited for a response with his ear tilted toward the radio. For a moment there was silence, only the sound of wind and rain, until a quiet crackle emanated from its speakers. Through a steady crackle of static and modulating waves, a garbled voice came through. Nothing intelligible. This is Sergeant McHale. Please repeat your last transmission, he said with the hope in his voice, desperately wanting to believe that his transmission somehow made it back to command. He waited again, staring at the radio as if it were about to get up and dance. He again heard static and then nothing. McHale tried again and again, attempting to communicate with anyone who could give him any further instructions, or better yet, anyone who could evacuate him and the remains of his unit. Finally, McHale gave up his futile attempts. He knew that it was extremely unlikely that any transmission he sent would make it out of the zone, let alone without being distorted by the background radiation. He knew as much from the briefing. He slumped back again. He thought back to the flight into the zone from the brigade staging area in Bucha, just northwest of Kiev. As he watched the Hind burn not yards from him, he tried to remember anything the team flew over that could have been helpful. He remembered looking down and seeing the cordon and roadblocks from the air, and seeing what looked to be cattle trucks coming out of the zones toward the cordon. He couldn't remember passing over anything resembling a settlement or a military outpost. Only a few large piles of what looked to be garbage and wrecked vehicles. McHale flicked his finished cigarette into the grass to his right. As the rain continued to dampen his gear, he reckoned that he was somewhere south of Rostock. He began to shuffle through his rucksack, searching for something to eat as he waited for a radio signal or a rescue team to get a triangulation on his Heinz ELT beacon. Either way, he knew that his best bet was to remain at the crash site for as long as possible and to attempt to keep warm. He knew that it would only be a matter of hours before he was dead, and in this condition, there wasn't much hope of bushwhacking it back to civilization. As he searched his rucksack with his half-dead arms, his hand stopped as he felt the familiar shape of a Korovka that he purchased in Kiev. Taking the chocolate cookie out of the rucksack, he immediately removed the wrapper and began to devour it, caring little for the blood that covered his gloves. For a moment, McHale took pleasure in the little things. He had a whole box of the cookies in his rucksack, which he planned on sharing with his crew after their mission was completed. It was a unit tradition that stuck, and now that there was no more unit, he intended to eat one for each of his fallen comrades before death finally came for him. It was, after all, possibly the last act he could carry out, other than dying from exposure, that is. As he shoved the last one of the Korovka into his mouth, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eyes, just inside the tree line to his left, close to where the helicopter was burning. McHale focused his eyes onto the small, shadowy figures that began to emerge out of the darkened forest, slowly walking towards the crash on 4 legs. As lightning began to flash, he saw the eyes of what looked to be dogs light up. McHale readied his weapon and began to slowly scoot around the tree, attempting to use it to break the line of sight with the pack of dogs. He steadied himself against the tree and watched on in horror as the pack made its way up to the bodies of the crew. In the light of the fire, the sergeant could make out a few more features of the dogs. They seemed to be highly emaciated, looking as if they hadn't eaten in weeks. Their skin was stretched beyond natural limits around their bones, and some of the creatures had no skin on the tip of their heads, revealing a bone-white skull. Each of the animals began to rip and tear at the dead bodies around the crash, taking chunks of flesh off with each bite. A few of the pack began to drag the bodies off into the woods, Peter's body being one of them. His heart began to pound and sweat dripped off his face. Between his blurry vision and witnessing these mutated abominations dragging and mauling his dead comrades, the young sergeant could feel his knees buckling under the weight of his broken body and psyche. McHale shifted to get a better look at the animals. As he repositioned himself, his foot pressed down on a twig, causing a loud crack to echo through the drizzling rain. McHale's heart froze as he saw the dog closest to him snap its head up, staring in his direction. The animal began to sniff the air and slowly walk towards the tree that he was hiding behind. As if communicating without sound, the rest of the pack noticed this and began to slowly fan out, as if to flank their prey. From behind the tree, Mikhail took aim at one of the mutated dogs closest to him. After pushing the selector switch on his weapon to the fully automatic position, he held his breath, waiting for the perfect shot. The lead dog began to inch closer and closer, sniffing at the air as if attempting to find its prey. Mikhail knew that this mutant could sense him, and that the rest of the pack would be surrounding him as well. There was no point in trying to hide anymore. As his vision began to blur once more, he slowly started to squeeze the trigger, hoping that this burst of fire would not be in vain and at least one of the animals would die. Just before he could feel the trigger break, Mikhail's concentration was broken by the sound of other gunfire. Coming from the trees to his left, as if following behind the pack of hounds, at least 2 different rifles could be heard, firing bursts into the cluster of rabid animals. The pack turned to face their attackers, snarling and yipping as they dashed across the clearing towards their assailants. As the dogs charged into the tree line, red mists of blood and shredded flesh peppered the grass as they fell one by one. Mikhail watched from afar, as if he were looking at the animals being decimated, like the light at the end of a dark tunnel. He could hear rustling from the tree line, and shadowy movement just out of his sight. Then he saw 2 figures, humanoid as best he could tell, carrying weapons. He watched them walk through the clearing and rush up to the crash site, searching bodies and dog alike. Mikhail fell to one knee, catching himself with his left arm, but still trying to keep his weapon downrange as his legs finally gave out. Doubled over from pain, he began to cough. Immediately, the 2 strangers snapped their heads towards his hiding spot, raising their rifles. Through the tunnel vision, the wounded sergeant could make out the gas masks of the 2 faces. They weren't military. The pain from the throbbing in Mikhail's head became too much, and his vision began to go dark as he attempted to raise his rifle with one arm, hoping to at least put some form of resistance up before the end. The last thing Mikhail felt was his body hitting the cold, wet ground before finally losing consciousness. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm so happy to share this with you. If you guys could comment below on what you liked, what you disliked, or what you'd like to see in another one of these, I'd really appreciate it. If you guys enjoyed this story, I can do part 2 next week. I don't want to leave you all on the cliffhanger. Until next time, I'll see you in the zone.